Hi everyone. So I wanted to do a video post for Janet's class, the Teaching to Transgress book, chapters 10 to 14. This book is by far like the best book I've read in a very long time, and these chapters are by far my favorite of thus far in the book, particularly chapter 11 on language, but I'm going to start with chapter 10. So the first thing that the chapter sort of opens with is this quote: "To engage in dialogue is one of the simplest ways we can begin as teachers," and that really struck me in the sense of walking into a classroom and privileging the voice of the students. And that dialogue being the way to navigate through and understand and hear and learn from each other in a classroom. Whereas oftentimes in this conservative, sort of serious pedagogical model, oftentimes it's the quiet, the conservative, the attentive, the sort of obedient class that is the most studious and is equated with a sense of learning, as opposed to the creativity or the sensory or the expressive, and that being privileged um, in a progressive pedagogical manner. Um, and I think that when we think about dialogue and we think about engaging, for me, it landed in a progressive way, as opposed to that conservative pedagogical model. Um, she also talks about this point that really stuck out to me, is not being attached to an identity as an academic, and that very many academics in this conversation, in this interview that she's having, many academics walk into the experience knowing that that's what they want to do, knowing that that's who they are, who they want to be, whereas she never had that idea and therefore isn't married to that identity in that way. And it made me think about growing up. I was very achievement based and found a lot of value and fulfillment and a sense of self in the achievement. And so I, I was able to, that resonated with me in that sense of, if I didn't achieve, it spoke something to me about who I was. Whereas now, thinking about as a teacher, how criticism or how feedback will land, knowing that my identity is not tied in being a teacher, that my existence is beyond that. It just happens to be something that I do, but that I serve in a ton of capacities, and teaching is just one of those capacities in one of those ways. And so I really liked that idea of detaching identity from this sense of academia or even research or the things that we've spent so much time dealing with and sitting in. And then something else that really stuck out to me was this sort of this split between the mind and the body, that in this academic world, the mind is seen as the entity of value, whereas the body is devalued for those who are in groups of privilege and power. And what came up to me was, growing up, I didn't necessarily have the luxury of not paying attention to my body, right? I would leave the house, and before my mom would leave the house, you show up as a Flynn, and that means that, your clothes are pressed, they're ironed, you look neat, you look clean, you look, there's this idea of the way that you present your body is a reflection of what you have to offer the group, because you are not in that privileged and powerful and that dominant group. And so I thought it was interesting, the scenario that she gave of the professor that she had, that just kind of came with wrinkly clothes on, and that his body was never really questioned because his mind was ultimately what was most valued because of his privilege. And so I thought that was a really interesting way of articulating that split between the mind and the body, but that those that aren't found in dominant groups don't have the luxury of detaching from. They both go in the same. And then also, as a teacher, how you show up. She spoke about the senses, what the teacher smells like when they're walking around. Maybe if you even graze another student, or how you work within the space of the room, because your body is a part of who you are. And I definitely that took from that for me, I never got the, or was afforded the privilege of being privileged in such a way that my body didn't matter. And so I see the mind and body functioning in the same space of the classroom and having a similar impact on the student. Um, and pay attention to those details as well. And I thought that was a really, really interesting point. But then I just want to jump over to chapter 11 because that's my favorite chapter by far in this book. It was incredible how she breaks down language and the idea of standard English. It's not the speech of the exile, it is the language of conquest and domination in the United States. It is the mask which hides the loss of so many tongues, all these sounds of diverse native communities we will never know. Resonated so deeply with me, this idea of standard English really really being the preeminent, sort of dialect and way in which we converse, and how people that look like me, black people who were brought here, have really gone through this sort of stripping, this sort of dehumanizing process, um, culturally imperialistic process, colonizing process of um, anything that looked like the former. And so that sort of successive sort of breakdown, starting with the original African language, going to this form of English standard language, but then this Southern Black vernacular, and then even transforming further into these Ebonics that we see, that really came through in the 80s and 90s, and we see even now. And it reminded me of this example. There was this comedian, her name is Amanda Seales. She has an HBO special, and it's called I Be Knowing. And she's very articulate, she's very intelligent, but I think she strategically used that language of I be knowing. Now that I'm reading this chapter, it's making me think of using be as opposed to I am, or I will be, right? Like that, like the be is a form of identity, that's who I am. And if she includes that, there's a familiarity within the Black vernacular that we understand. There's a camaraderie. There's this language that is not necessarily readily seen by others. And it really landed for me in a different kind of way, and how we allow language to show up in the classroom with people who don't have English as their first language. Like, I don't think I've ever been in a classroom where people have just spoken freely from their first language, which I think would have been an amazing experience. And so that's what it made me think of. And that quote, that this is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you. So powerful. She also brings up this other amazing point about the Negro spirituals, or that were sung, and that the word nobody, I forget the line, but it was like nobody knows something, and they could have said no one, because no one would have been assimilate. It would have been similar to that sort of English standard vernacular. It would have been what that dominant presence would have downloaded to them. And yet, and still to this day, many of those Negro spirituals are still sung with that same Black vernacular, and it communicates something, and that's unique, that's special, that's significant, that tells its own story. And so I just thought that these chapters were insanely amazing, and I'm really glad that we're able to read this book. It's really been eye-opening for me, and then also from the teaching lens, how do I incorporate these ideas there? So I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and reflections, and what stood out most to you, what you heard, what you felt. This went longer than I thought, but thanks.